afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. I'm Julian Watterson, Chairman of the committee, and with me are Mr Laurie Hooper, Mrs Claire Barber, Ms Julie Edge, Mrs Jane Paul Wilson and Mr Chris Robertshaw. The topic today is the Isle of Man Government procurement process, and we've invited Mr Nick Black, Chief Executive Officer of the Department of Infrastructure, to talk to us about how these work in the department. Welcome, Mr Black.
Thank you.
Well, Mrs Paul Wilson.
Thank you very much. Mr Black, if I could begin, please, by just asking you broadly what you think works well with the procurement process and whether there's anything you find frustrating or would change.
Mrs Paul Wilson, that's a very broad, sweeping statement, a sweeping opportunity, so I'll try and narrow myself. The Isle of Man Government's procurement process, as I'm sure you very well know, responds to a procurement policy that, as best I can recall, went through to Tynwald and was approved. And that aims to cover a number of things, summed up probably best under the title of best value for the taxpayer. We tend, when looking at procurement, I think, to get fixated upon the detail of the actual how many bits of paper, what did we achieve, how long did it take us. But it's probably fair to take a step back because, as with all civil servants, we act within a policy framework. And if you go back to that document, there are a number of objectives that we're asked to achieve. And it sometimes feels that it might have been better to put them in a ranked order. So, for example, let's take an easy one. There are times when the policy says we should be looking at maximising local economic benefit, and that's entirely laudable, entirely clear, and I can see that there'll be a groundswell of support for that. But at the same time, right above it is value for money. Those two don't necessarily go together unless you count value as being local value is more than that value. We also talk about giving people opportunities to bid. Yet there are times when, to secure value for money, I might be tempted as a chief officer to look for a contract value of 7 to 10 years if we were looking to do something that was closer towards, I hesitate to say outsourcing, but you perhaps understand what I mean, a large contract for, let's say, we could, for example, place a contract for some big aspects of highway maintenance, like surfacing. And where contractors have to invest in expensive plant, training for their staff, and realistically have to tool up, if you like, for a specific job. A 3-year standard term, potentially with an extra 2 years, is going to support the contract opportunities objective, but perhaps not support the value for money, nor will it necessarily attract people to bid for it. I think the chairman has indicated through his clerk that you might want to talk about the feedback from the suppliers, so perhaps we'll come back to that. So I think in terms of what works well, I think the procurement process works as well as it can to hit multiple targets. Does it hit one particular one perfectly? Well, like so much of what we do, when we're trying to aim at 3 or 4 objectives, we might end up compromising between them. So we have some schemes, for example, we've had for many years in our department a hired haulage list, and anyone who wants to move things around for us can apply to go onto that list. It's a framework contract in your terms, an AFA. And we effectively can end up in a situation where we phone the person who's number 1 on the list because they've put the cheapest price in, and they might say, oh, I don't want to do that tomorrow, I've already got a booking. So then we'll phone the next person. So no, we can't do next Wednesday, but we could do Thursday, and we can spend a lot of officer time going through a list. It's designed to suit best value because the cheapest provider that meets the specification is first, but it can cost a lot to administer. And with lower value work, there's a need to balance that. So you'll recognise from the regulations, and I'm sure you've seen in the FPN, Financial Practice Note, the FPN, at the very start of Financial Direction C, there's this flow chart. I can show you if you wish, but I'm sure you've seen it, page 29, for those who are, like some people here, intimate with the page numbers. But that takes you through it. And it's very, very clear that for the lower value items, you have to show that you tried to get good value, but you don't have a burdensome... We could all argue where the thresholds are. There is always going to be a threshold. I fully support the view that you have to have, or that you should have, a clear and simple system for low value contracts, and that as the value goes up, so does the governance. That seems logical to me. So if you're looking for a 7-year contract worth $1 million a year, you're not going to do that on 2 phone calls and a note in your diary. That's going to be something you're going to do through the Attorney Generals, through full tendering, through detailed governance, because you're making a very long-term, very high-value commitment. So overall, given the huge range of things that government's trying to achieve, the regulations and the procurement system works well.
So,
in terms of frustrations...
Yes, go on, carry on.
Sorry. In terms of frustrations, one of our challenges across the organisation is that we haven't particularly been fantastic about reducing priorities. We tend to add new priorities without taking the old ones off. So we have a procurement team which is currently within the Attorney General's chambers, which has, I think it would be fair to say, limited resources. Now, we all have limited resources. My question, I think, would be, is it adequate for the work put that way? I know that as a department we're lucky that there is a full-time officer allocated to our work in terms of pushing our procurement through. We get very good high-quality help from our legal and procurement colleagues in the Attorney General's. The quality of their work I find to be first class, and I think they do a very good job of supporting us. But at the moment, if you said to me, Nick, if you're going to put that to them today, when will you see it again? I'll be saying 16 weeks. If you say to me, how long will it take the procurement to be done for a big piece of work from start to finish, and this is not a dig at the Attorney General's colleagues, because the start is within the department, and the specification is a piece of this scheme that perhaps is one of the areas where you might conclude that, you know, if you get the specification right, then everything should flow well. We should probably invest more officer time in that. Do we have enough resource put into the procurement process? I'm not convinced we do. Could we have more colleagues in the Attorney General's chambers to bring that time down? Yes, we could. Could we have spent more time writing specifications? Yes, but we don't have somebody who just writes specifications. We have somebody who's trying to get hedges cut all over the island, who has to find a way of writing a hedge cutting contract, and so on and so forth. So it can feel burdensome and time-consuming. But as public servants, we have to balance that against the objectives of the policies in which we work, which means that we've got to establish best value. We've got to make sure it's fair. We've got to make sure it survives challenge, as you know, Mrs. Paul Wilson, certainly, as a principle of natural justice, as an appeal route. And several contracts lately have been appealed, and I don't know if they're on the list of the ones you want to talk about, but a number of the ones I've been involved in have been appealed. That the head of the Audit Assurance Division has upheld some of those, and they've had to be either rerun or cancelled. In a situation as we are, where you have typically a very limited number of bidders for some of our work, if the procurement can't proceed and you need a cooling off period because prices may have been revealed, or as part of the appeal some of the detail of the scoring was made transparent, you can be waiting 6 to 12 months for a fair, defensible cooling off period. And how are you delivering the service? So we have one at the moment where, for a variety of reasons, and this is not necessarily a procurement problem, but it's a overall problem of contract management. You've asked me to talk about procurement, but of course for me procurement is not a standalone item. Procurement sits alongside governance of financial regs, it sits along authorisations, it sits alongside what am I going to give an exemption for, what do I get an exemption for, it sits alongside legal, and the one that we perhaps have, I think it's fair to say, discussed before is, how does government work in government to business negotiations? Some of you have got backgrounds in private sector businesses. I'm not saying we should be able to sort everything out over a cup of tea or a pint of beer or on a handshake, absolutely not. But some businesses are very, very slick at maximising the value and at negotiation. So I've been, apart from a few years where I went to the dark side, I've been a public servant for almost all my seemingly lengthy years at work.
You're on the dark side now.
No, I did 3 years in the private sector, Mr. Robert Shaw. But I'm broadly, I'm a public servant. I was a public servant in the UK, I'm a public servant here. I'm very proud of that, very happy to do it. But when I go up against the appeal group to try and negotiate the value of a piece of land and the contract around it, that's a tough day at work.
So, on that, I mean, you've given us a lot there that I think between us we'll want to explore. But I think one of the first things you talked about the procurement policy and the different factors that are being weighed in. The procurement policy is quite clear that departments can consider for themselves the proportionate application of these different factors. And so I wondered whether, when it comes to the DoI, when you begin a procurement process, how do your officers ensure that the particular procurement process is designed and run to meet the particular policy objectives? How is that approached?
Mrs. Paul Wilson, you'll know that underlying the procurement rules are the financial regulations in totality, and I suspect by the nature of your committee you're well used to dealing with those. And they have a comply or exempt type approach. So comply or explain. You either follow the rules as they're written, or you say, I need to change that. And that's laudable. But the easiest, quickest way is to follow what's already done. Because if you apply to vary, or you say I'm going to do it differently, a delay is inserted, a need to seek approval is there. So the classic one we've talked about time and time again is the balance between cost and quality. And it's very clearly set up at the moment that you could not have 100% on quality. You must have, typically we do 50-50. We can go to 60-40, but we tend to then need to be asking permission for that. Because the direction of travel is that we should be seeking best value first and quality second.
Yeah. But I understood you couldn't get more than 50% cost.
Well, I've challenged that myself with the Chief Financial Officer, or I've asked, it's a fair way to put it. Treasury can waiver everything, as you know. So I could go to Treasury and say, this contract is so sensitive, it's so safety critical, that we really must have 75% on quality because people will die. And
but it's part of the exemption process. If it goes more than 50.
There is an exemption process for it.
Sorry.
But using the exemption process requires you to put your head above the parapet and to ask, please, sir, may I have? So I think we rarely vary from these principles. We stick to what's written on the page, which is, have you shown that you've got the best price? Is the quality acceptable? Because as the chairman said, it's that way round.
So if I were to expand this idea, though, of policy objectives, for example, cost and quality are two aspects, but if we were looking at procuring buses, for example, other policy objectives that might be relevant are environmental, accessibility.
Yes.
So I suppose what I'm asking is, how does the department manage the many valid policy objectives, and how do you manage when these policy objectives may actually come into tension? So what is your process for prioritising those? And if you do need to stick your head above the parapet and say, actually, there's a cost implication, but if we don't look at that, we're not going to address these other policy objectives. So how do you approach that?
This comes back, in my experience, to the specification and setting the specification. And what your point is interesting, because if we take the policy objectives, and it's perhaps best served by an example. You mentioned buses. As you can imagine, over what seems like, I think, just under 10 years, I've been involved in the procurement of buses more than once. And you know, I think, Mrs. Paul Wilson, from your general understanding of the island, that we recently bought hybrid buses. Those hybrid buses cost more than the conventional bus. I don't think that will shock anyone. They carry a second bit of drivetrain effectively. There's an electric motor that will provide some assistance to reduce the impact on the environment. As Tynwald, you've signed up to a policy on sustainability and climate adaptation and responding to the climate challenge, and that, again, is entirely fair. So we specified the hybrid drivetrain, but I had to return to seek the extra money because there wasn't enough in the budget, and we weren't successful in the bid for extra money. So we've had to do it and try and find the money by working elsewhere. So, as it happens, this perhaps isn't the place to discuss accessibility in detail. We haven't down-specced anything else, but we want to try and provide a service that meets the needs of all our customers. So, and you know, perhaps with a nod to the regular bus travellers amongst you, providing charging points benefits all our travellers, because people seem to want to look at their phones the whole journey now, and it's rare now to see someone reading a book. But the charging points are an extra cost item that we have provided because we see a commercial benefit, because people will then enjoy the journey and make another journey. But we have to trade all this off. And you refer to policy. Ultimately, each division has a member, Key items of procurement are discussed with that member. Some are highly technical. Of course, buying buses, it's not like buying a car. The list of options goes on forever. You have to specify the axle ratios, the size of everything, the power output. A whole range of things has to be determined, where the buttons are, where the poles are, what sort of seat you buy, what sort of cover goes on it. It's an endless list of hundreds of items. So I think there is a very critical area there that we need to look further at, which is how do we ensure that for an item like that we absolutely get the specification exactly right to meet a number of policy objectives. We tend to be driven primarily by price and by need. If we're replacing 6 buses, we need 6 buses more. We've established the number. Can we buy them within the budget?
Oh. So just while we're on buses, though, I mean, it does seem that you can specify whatever you like as long as it's a Mercedes at the moment, though, isn't it? I mean, there seems to be very much a brand masochism there towards one particular manufacturer.
For the last bus procurement that I signed the order for, Chairman, I had prices in front of me from 3 different manufacturers. Now, why do we tend to buy Mercedes for single-deckers and tend to buy Wright's Volvo for double-deckers? The latest batch of double-deckers is slightly different because there are Wright's bus fitted with a Mercedes engine, and as you've no doubt experienced. If we simply stuck with buying the cheapest one, we could in theory end up with a fleet with 5 different types of bus, 20 different types of van. But we carry parts for all these vehicles. Parts cost us money. We train staff on them, and the more the vehicle value, the more the investment you make. So if you ask me about the Mercedes one, if I just finished that, although it's not widely trumpeted because we don't, the department has now sought and gained accreditation as a Mercedes-Benz dealer. So we're a service agent for Mercedes-Benz bus and coach. That means that when we had visitors coming in coaches, as you know we did historically, we have done increasingly, it's a good market for a range of our hotels benefit from the coach and tour groups. Had someone come across in a Mercedes Turismo coach, we could have done the servicing and the repair work on that vehicle.
But in terms of...
So we get a huge discount on parts. So it would make sense for us. We've got the Mercedes computer, we've got service-trained staff, and we do Volvos as well. So typically for large vehicles, we do buy Volvo bus and truck, a Volvo bus truck. We buy Mercedes bus and truck and vans.
But I understand, Mr. Black, that you know, for example, a Mercedes gearbox costs about £4,500. A Volvo costs £1,000. A Mercedes windscreen costs £1,000. A Volvo costs £400. A wing mirror costs £800 for the Mercedes. A Volvo costs £75. So we'd have to be making really big discounts on these sort of rates in order to actually say that the parts we're buying is in any way comparable between the Mercedes and the Volvo.
Mr. Watson, none of those prices make sense to me. So I will happily check everyone. If you'd like to, perhaps your clerk, perhaps Joe will send me a list of those prices, and I'll get you the parts price that we actually pay.
Okay.
If you've been on the internet, they're very, very. I cannot imagine buying a bus gearbox for a Volvo bus for £1,000. At £4,000 for a Mercedes ones, I'd be thrilled because my estimation is it's a £7,000 part.
Okay.
And it's in many cases we can buy parts under one arrangement that fit both buses, so they tend. We have recently changed, but until now all our buses have had ZF gearboxes. We've now got a Voith on the latest one, so we've had to carry additional parts. They tend to have ZF rear axles, again significant parts commonality between Mercedes and Volvo. So that works for us, but I cannot see that the same gearbox will be £1,000 for one unless you're buying it scrapped from a dealer who's just hoiked it out of the back of a broken one.
I mean, the other one I just wanted to thought I'd throw into the mix was in 2019-20 the department spent nearly £67,000 on emergency repairs, and that again seems quite a lot for when we have quite a new fleet.
It depends is the answer. We do have a newish fleet. We have vehicles now that are over 750,000 kilometres. Typically a Citara will do 100,000 kilometres a year. Like all commercial vehicles, the speedometers are in kilometres. We know that as we sail past the 700,000 mark, we're likely to chalk up 50 grand in per parts. And that's only 3 parts. That's an engine, a rear axle and a gearbox. If you add in a little bit of labour, that's a 50 grand bill. So when you recall the SAVE report that was undertaken into bus and rail, there was an analysis there of the fleet age, and it did, you're quite right, Mr Watterson, say we tend to have a younger fleet and we tend to dispose at a younger age than you would in the UK. Typically, we'll get 8 years out of us, 7.5 to 8 years out of Sataros, and a UK firm might get 10. And that the people who did that work for Treasury said, but it makes sense because you don't have heavy maintenance repair on the island and you can't just borrow a bus when one breaks. So we were able to explain why that was the case. And I remain of the view that it is worth investing in a good quality fleet because we're trying to serve the public. This is, if we're going to deal with issues like climate change, we have to be encouraging people to use the bus or to walk rather than to drive. So it needs to be a good quality vehicle that doesn't break down. In terms of emergency repairs, if you have an engine fire, then you're in for a big money. If you bust a gearbox or an axle, it does happen. I actually, given the cost, one bus could be £50,000. They're not cheap vehicles to buy or to run. So you can't scale, I know this doesn't apply to you, Chairman, but you can't scale the costs of a car gearbox, which might be £1,000. Heavy goods vehicles are very valuable, very expensive items, and their parts are similarly expensive.
Sorry.
I just had one question for you, actually, when you talked about the hybrid bus procurement process. So you said that you went out and you spec'd everything up, and then when it came down to it, you had to go back to Treasury and ask for additional funding. I would have thought that as part of the specification process, you'd have had a reasonably good handle on what this might or might not cost you. So it's a bit strange to find out you've got to go back at the end of the process to ask for more money. Do you find that actually that process itself isn't particularly helpful in terms of you know what the best outcome is that you're looking for, and in that case the best outcome was we want these hybrid buses because you think they're the best thing to buy, and actually then being prevented from achieving that best outcome because actually the focus is very much on price as opposed to value? Do you think that's an issue?
It's always a challenge, but it would be wrong of me to anyway seek to find fault with Treasury colleagues for wanting to look after the pounds, shillings and pence. That's their job, that's their role. They're there to make sure we get best value. They're there to scrutinise us much in the same way you do. They could quite reasonably have come back and said, we'll buy fewer buses, Nick. But for it was less than 10% extra. It was about crudely. Let me just think. About 5-6% something extra price. Could we find it by looking at overall budgets? Yes, we could. Would it have been best to say, actually, we'd rather pay a little more for a hybrid? Yes. When electric vehicles come in, we do have some additional funds for electric cars because it was accepted that they have a high initial cost and a lower whole life cost. That's a direction we need to do to take forward. And when electric buses are available of a form that will work here, I'll be going back to Treasury and saying, look, these cost more to buy, but they will be cheaper to run long term. And I would expect that they might reduce, for example, our diesel fuel purchasing budget as a result. That would be entirely fair. As with all of these things, Mr Hooper, there's a balance, and it's about understanding the legitimate position of both parties. But that's sort of my experience of negotiations generally.
The reason I asked the question is you've also made reference that price is the primary factor, the driving factor in what you're trying to achieve. But actually the procurement policy itself, under the achieving best value principle, talks about very specifically the government recognises that the lowest price does not always represent the best outcome, and only in specific circumstances should contracts be awarded based on the lowest price. But what you're actually telling us is in practice, actually price has a much greater weighting, a much greater importance than the quality, the value of what you're trying to achieve, which seems to be directly in contradiction to what the procurement policy says we should be doing.
If you were to look at, and maybe you've done this or will be doing this as part of your assessment, if you look at the way some contracts are scored, so particularly, let's take the bigger ones where we've gone to tender, we have a scoring matrix that's defined at the start of the process. I have certainly seen ones where you would have had to do phenomenally well on quality versus someone who'd done phenomenally badly, because the calculation, if you like, it means that once you've got price, you really are there. Yeah. So for some contracts, even some of quite low value, if you bid, I've seen one where it's a few grand less a year. I mean, we really are talking quite small amounts. The other organisation effectively was never going to overwhelm that, even though they might be phenomenally better, their paperwork might be better, their safety policy might be better, and that's the challenge. And as the accountable officer, I am allowed, as you quite rightly to say, that one is cheap as chips, but it just isn't good enough. It may not be safe, it may not be reliable, they may not trade the full course of the contract. There are a lot of factors we can have to put in, but that's back into this comply or explain, which I absolutely understand, but explaining is harder than complying.
But isn't that fundamentally a problem with how that calculation works? It's a quite deep-seated problem, that.
So we're back to the specification to make sure you've absolutely identified everything that matters, but the calculation process is set.
But I think that's the problem that I'm driving at actually here, is irrelevant of the specification you set, really. If a bidder comes in and they do tick all the boxes, provided they are offering the lowest price, actually, they're going to get it. And so this attitude of actually comply is easier than explain. So it doesn't really fit with what the intention, I think, of the procurement policy is. So what I'm seeing is the intention is we're looking for value for the taxpayer, but what actually happens on the ground is it's all about price. It's all about getting the cheapest outcome because of that process that we've already described, and that culture really of, yes, I don't want to have to go and explain myself to Treasury on every single issue. Would it not be better to say, actually, this is a problem, we need to fix the underlying core issue here?
Perhaps a better example, if I may just take you into another area, is when it comes to the spend in the local economy. I think we all recognise why that's there. That's there to help local businesses to make sure that the money doesn't flow off the island. There's a lot of sense. We don't need to discuss that now. And I think this is an area that Mrs. Edge and I discussed when she was in the department, because typically the off-island firms score higher than the local firms.
In what areas?
In local economic value. Now, you might have to call in various documents to check this, but my experience is the off-island firms see that section and work. They see that and they think, how am I going to get points here? So they put down, I'm going to have a hotel for 10 nights for my visiting supervisor. I'm going to shop and buy all my stationery locally. And they work it. And who can knock them for it? They absolutely say, here's where my work will contribute to your economy. Some of the local firms, I think, almost perhaps mistakenly think, well, I'm local, so I'll get that point. But they don't say, I've got 32 people on the payroll, they're all paying tax. They don't say, and you know as well as I do, you can't make assumptions when you're scoring tender bids. You can't say, oh, I know them, they've got 20 people locally and they support the local economy by charitable giving. It's what they write down in their bid. We can only assess what we have in front of us. So the intention of that is entirely laudable. But in practice, I find that the reports I get from my colleagues, and I should perhaps have prefaced this at the point Mrs. Paul Moulton asked me the first question, you'll appreciate that I don't do a lot of the detailed procurement work myself, and I know Joe realises that was never the intention. You know, I don't sit there and score every single contract, otherwise I would never have time to do great things like this. But the work on local economic tends to give points to off-island firms.
So
There's something missing then, isn't there?
I think it's back to the point the chairman made, is the mechanics of the process outweighing, and Mr. Hooper's point, outweighing the principle that it was due to drive.